In today's video, I'll be showing you how to paint this cozy mushroom illustration in Procreate. If you are new to my channel, my name is Hasina. I'm an artist, illustrator, and designer based in the UAE, and Mostly Florals on YouTube is my dedicated profile where I teach Procreate tips, tricks, digital painting, and more. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't yet for weekly amazing content and follow me on Instagram at mostly.florals. For today's painting, I'll be using a canvas size of 8 inches by 11 inches and a cozy autumnal color palette. You can click the link in the description box below to download the color palette and the outline art, which you can directly import into your Procreate app to start painting. First, you will need to create a rough sketch of your illustration. You can find inspiration on Pinterest, which is a great place to discover tons of ideas. I often refer to nature-inspired images and combine ideas from several different pictures to build my illustration. Here we have the rough sketch with opacity reduced to about 50%, and in a new layer which I've renamed Refine Sketch, I'll start creating the final outline. This will be much neater and cleaner. Feel free to use any brush that you like. As always, the type of brush doesn't really matter for this illustration. Procreate has plenty of default brushes you can easily use. Now that I'm done with my final refined outline, here's how I color pick and create my palette. I do it pretty randomly, drawing inspiration from the season and the colors I've been noticing over the past couple of weeks. On my base layer, I'll begin the painting. First, I'll reduce the opacity of the refined sketch, and then, back on the base layer, I'll start painting. Let's begin with the mushroom cap. The painting part of this video will mostly be sped up, as it takes me quite a while to refine the edges until I'm fully satisfied. That's mainly due to the nature of the gouache brush I'm using. This brush creates pigmented layers every time I lift the pencil and draw on top, so I'll be using the blend tool to smooth it out. Now, if you want to create darker borders and add shadows to your illustration, you can simply alpha lock the layer and paint the edges with a darker shade of the same color you're using. Then use the blend tool with any brush to blend the colors smoothly. I've shown how to do this in my previous video on gouache florals, so feel free to watch that for a full demonstration. Now that I'm happy with the mushroom cap, let's move on. I'm going to paint the underside of the mushroom cap next. Let's create a new layer and make sure it's placed below the mushroom cap layer. I don't always name all my layers, but if you prefer to stay organized, feel free to do so. Now let's move on to the mushroom stem. I'll be painting this on a new layer, and I'm going to place this layer between the mushroom cap and the underside layer. I'll start by drawing the border and then painting inside. I don't use color drop because it doesn't give the texture I want, so it's better to paint manually for the effect. This also depends on the brush that you're using. If you're using a brush like the monoline brush or studio pen, then color drop works perfectly fine. I'm creating a new layer right at the top, selecting a green shade, and I'll be painting the first leaf. The second leaf will go on a layer below this one. I like to keep all my elements on separate layers so that any changes can be made easily, just in case I decide to adjust something later. Also, remember to use the blend tool and eraser tool if you're using the same brush as I am, because overlapping elements can cause some see-through areas. Those need to be cleaned up. Now, moving on to the flowers. Let's start with the first one here. I'm choosing this lovely lavender purple shade and beginning with the petals one at a time. Now I'll paint the sepal and stem using a different shade of green. Make sure to place your layers carefully behind the other elements since this flower is positioned in the background. Now I'll do the same with the other flower, but this time I'll start with the stem and sepal first, then move on to the flower. This flower has a different, slightly wilted style, which gives it a really cute look. Now I'd like to add some shading and dimension to the leaves I painted earlier. I'll be choosing slightly darker shades to create the shadows. I'll be using my favorite bonobo chalk brush for this, as it's perfect for adding texture and depth. This brush is also free to download. Just Google bonobo chalk and you'll easily find it. I'll also be using some darker and lighter shades with my gouache brush to add some shadows and highlights, and then I'll blend everything using the blend tool. While this doesn't always show the obvious textures of the bonobo chalk, it still helps me to achieve the traditional painted look I'm aiming for in my illustration. I'll also play around with adding shadows and hues to the other leaf and finish everything off with some simple details. Moving on to adding shades to the stem here, I'll use a darker shade of the same green, a bit of black, and an off-white shade to add highlights. I'll do all of this using a smudgy brush. You can use the bonobo chalk or leather brush for this. Finally, blend everything slowly for a smooth finish. For the petals, I'll be adding some white and darker purple shades, then blending them as well. It takes me quite a while to build up the shades for each element, but I really enjoy adding shadows. It makes such a great difference compared to using flat colors, bringing the illustration to life. Now I'll do the same for the other flower as well. Now on a new layer, I'll paint these leaves, starting by filling in the base color. Then I'll add shadows using darker shades and use different brushes as well. And then finally, finish it off with some simple details. Now, moving on to the mushroom cap, my favorite part, I'm going to start adding shadows using both darker and lighter shades, blending them in until I'm fully satisfied. After that, I'll add the cute spots on top. Before adding the spots, I make sure to turn on the sketch layer so it's easier to see where to place them. Then I fill the areas in between with tiny details to give the mushroom a magical fairy tale look. Now I'll continue adding shadows to the underside layer. I'll use a slightly darker shade than the base color, and alpha locking the layer makes it easier to apply the shadows. After adding the shades and blending them, I'll finish off with some tiny line details. Now I'm adding shadows to the stem using darker shades and blending them in. Let's move on to painting the flower on the right. I'll start with the stem using a shade of green and then continue with the tiny wavy leaves. Once I'm done with the base layer, I'll alpha lock it and add shadows using darker shades. I really enjoy adding details to leaves like this. It makes them look so much prettier and more polished. Now on a new layer at the top, I'll paint this flower using a beige shade. I'll start with the base, then alpha lock the layer and add some darker shades to the center, blending them in to give the flower more dimension. Now I'll paint this berry plant, starting with the simple stem and branches. Then I'll move on to painting the plum colored berries, using multiple shades of plum and layering them for depth. As you can see, I'm cleaning up some parts of the stems that are showing through, even though this layer is behind. Now I'll move on to the final leafy element. As before, I'll work on each leaf in a new layer, and once I'm done with the base green shade, I'll add shadows and details to them. Here I'm cleaning up the edges of this element using the eraser tool set to monoline brush. Finally, I'm adding a patch of grass-like background in a green-gray shade, and I'll need to do some cleaning up here as well. There might be a better way to do this that I'm not aware of, but this is how I work with the gouache brush I'm using. Once I'm done erasing, I'll add some shadows and blend them a little. So here's the final look of my magical mushroom in Procreate. I really love the colors and how everything turned out. I thoroughly enjoyed painting this and sharing the process with you. I hope you enjoyed watching it. If you did, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and subscribe to my channel. I'll be posting new content every week. See you in the next video, and until then, happy creating!